And the thing you need to sort of impose upon these people making those decisions is think about all the free time you're going to have to now innovate and do things that are more meaningful for your business, because you don't have to worry about the server X or data connection X or what have you running in the data center. It's not your problem anymore.
There's a whole bunch of content in the enterprise that people shouldn't even know exists.
We're waiting for the industry to catch up to us.
You're talking about the empowerment of the individual over the empowerment of the establishment.
Yeah, I'm really pleased to welcome Duncan McGregor, the Vice President of Engineering and Operations at TeraGo. Thanks for joining me today, Duncan. How are you?
I'm great, Jason. Thanks for having me. I'm definitely excited to see what we're going to talk about today.
And TeraGo, well, obviously you have, as a public company, an international influence. It is a Canadian company. Maybe you could talk a little bit about managed services and managed services in the context of other organizations that may be looking at cloud and how that's happened in Canada contrasted to other areas of the world.
Yeah, it's interesting. So we're seeing a couple of interesting trends in the Canadian market. I think the one fascinating thing is, as popular as cloud is, overall cloud adoption, I would say in Canada has been slow, right? Or slower than some of our neighboring countries, right? So when you look at, the United States, and the adoption of large scale platforms like Amazon and Azure, there are large companies running on those. Netflix is the one that comes to mind, where they're running everything on AWS. And in Canada, it's been a much slower adoption to, into the cloud. So we're still seeing companies adopt cloud, as early as yesterday. Right? We will get calls saying, "Help, I need to get into the cloud." And it's fascinating when we think it's been something that we've been dealing with for, how long ago you and I were working at OpenText. We called it application service provider back in the day. But that to me is cloud, and that's 20 years ago, right? So we've been dealing with these cloud technologies forever, but a lot of companies and customers are not, and they're just embarking on their cloud journey right now.
Because in Canada, obviously, there's a lot of industries that are heavily resource focused. There's energy industries. Is there something industry specific that might lead to our the decisions that we've made around our adoption of perhaps managed services or other techniques over cloud?
There's a couple of things that come to mind that we see. I mean, one of it's just very obvious. When a client is at a natural point in their refresh cycle, they're staring down at I've got a capital investment to make. Do I buy all these servers again? It's really the classic business case for cloud. Do I want to spend capital dollars on server infrastructure again, or do I want to migrate to a cloud platform? So that's certainly one decision point that we see, and that doesn't have to be industry specific at all, right? And then there are other verticals that have decided they don't want to deal with all the processing, and again, it's almost a classic. Another classic reason for cloud adoption is I don't want to spend time and money on things that aren't my core competency. So if I'm a logistics company, or if I'm a warehouse or what have you, I don't want to spend all that time on infrastructure. I want to spend time on logistics, things that make my business get good at what they're supposed to be at. And so we're still seeing things like that, where they just want help getting their IT infrastructure under control because they can't, right? And you and I think have talked about this before. There's so many new technologies coming at everybody that it's almost analysis paralysis, right? You've got the IT guys trying to figure out, what do I buy for my environment, and they don't know where to go, right? So as a service provider, I think that's where we can step in with a breadth of capabilities and say, well, here's what we would recommend, and here's how we can help you with that.
Maybe you could talk about your experience working with IT organizations, and how do you help them innovate and demonstrate that being innovative is part of their track, in addition to being good stewards of their data and infrastructure?
Yeah, I think the big thing you got to help them with is there's a natural fear, right? Because I think cloud is often viewed as it's outsourced, right? And in a way it is, right? You're handing over, part of your job to someone else. So there's a natural fear of the sort of the frontline IT people to say, well, what does that mean for me? Does that mean I'm in fact not innovative, right? I'm doing things that might put my job at risk. And so you have to help them get over that fear of, you're doing the exact opposite. You're not putting your job at risk. I would argue you're making your job more successful, because you are going to demonstrate, some innovative ideas to your senior leadership, looking at the technologies. All these guys have, often people have the CIO magazine or what have you on the table, and they're reading about all these technologies. So for the IT people to come forward and say, we should be adopting these, helping them overcome that to say, this will be good for our business, and it's not bad for my job at all. In fact, it's going to benefit me because it make my life easier. So I think the big thing is helping them overcome that fear of what it means for their own job. It's the fear of the unknown, right? And part of it too is, we grew up through these ranks, right? You become a bit of a control freak when you're the guy who's the one looking after the data center or the servers or, application X. So you're handing over control, so to speak, to a third party. And the thing you need to sort of impose upon these people making those decisions is think about all the free time you're going to have to now innovate and do things that are more meaningful for your business, because you don't have to worry about the server X or data connection X or what have you running in the data center. It's not your problem anymore. It's mine, right? As a service provider, it becomes mine. So I think helping them overcome that fear, but also then realize that it gives them an opportunity to be more creative in their own role. I think that's the challenge that we face. Yeah.
One of the things that, in my opinion, disqualifies just traditional cloud, like your Azures, your Googles, and your Amazons, is using them for just pure storage workloads, because you are stuck with your slowest data point, which is an unmanaged internet connection to that service provider. You can't enforce that they're going to be using all the NVMe storage. That would cost you probably just as much or more as buying it all for yourself.
Yep.
So it makes a lot of sense to partner with a managed service provider or try to consume those types of services if that's not an option, which to me just kind of eliminates all the bottlenecks associated with cloud. You just can't use those if you want to get these performance gains.
Yeah, we're even seeing, I'm hoping to see shortly, the compute side move really aggressively towards an as a service model. Well, really, it's the same concept where I'm growing and refreshing technology on an as needed basis, rather than, again, being faced with these, once annually or whatever that cycle is with these massive capital refreshes, right? So the entire industry is really moving towards an as a service model, in areas where you thought you were spending large capital dollars. That's changing, right? Which is really, it's really interesting for us as a service provider to have that link of usage and costs linked together like that.
Yeah, that is super powerful, and certainly one of the biggest inspirations to talk to you today, because we come out of going through with oil and gas companies and power plants and others who are sitting on this old infrastructure that might be getting 7 megabytes per second of data transfer. And when we're talking about terabytes of data distributed across their networks and in other locations, think of the human cost associated with every time you're requesting something, you got to wait 40 seconds for it to load across 4,000 users. That gets really expensive. So if you can turn to TeraGo, or you can figure out how to implement that infrastructure for yourself, how big is the cost savings associated with that? Like the human time and getting people what they need when they need it faster.
Yeah, unmeasurable, right? I mean, it's the productivity is, it's unmeasurable when you're saving minutes, to hours of time per employee on a, daily basis. That's unmeasurable, right?
Another component of this to consider is that there's a lot of workloads that are happening way out at the edge. And then that information is going to be coming to a central location. You had mentioned before about mining sites and in other industries that are like that might prohibit moving full workloads into traditional cloud. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how these organizations are setting up private network infrastructure and how they're setting up their remote compute loads and their centralized storage associated with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where and you and I have talked about this, outside of these types of calls, the expansion and contraction of compute, I'll call it methodology over time, is really interesting. You think way back in the day, mainframes, and then PCs distributed everything, right? They became cheap and ubiquitous for everybody to have their own. And then the cloud technology showed up and everybody's sort of consolidating back into a central point again. And now with these, new technologies like AI and IoT and the amount of data processing that's going to happen on site, it's distributing again. And you mentioned exactly the point is private networks is a really big thing that's coming down the pipe for TeraGo. When we look at 5G technologies blended with edge compute these companies want to keep their data on site, and not necessarily because they're worried about privacy, although that is a huge concern for some of them. The processing locally is really important. So you think about a mine that's perhaps driving large trucks around a mining pit, they can't have that going back to the cloud. All those controlling operations have to happen locally. So we're seeing that trend going right back the other way, where private networks distributed again, perhaps a blended where they'll gather and do batch uploads, overnight to a cloud for processing if they don't want to have a massive AI analytic engine on site. But we're really seeing that trend going back to a distributed model, which is just fascinating to see that expansion and contraction of compute technologies, right? The challenge that TeraGo faces, in reality with 5G,
Yeah,
is just, we're waiting for the industry to catch up to us, right?
sure.
So we have spectrum holdings that are quite valuable. We have what's called millimeter wave spectrum. So when you think about 5G technologies, there's really three bands of spectrum that make 5G work, right? There's low band, which is kind of your below 3,500 megahertz. Then there's mid band, which is kind of 3,500 and up. And then there's millimeter wave, which is kind of 24 gigahertz and higher. And you need all three to have a really, or at least two of the three to have a robust solution, right? And there's reasons for that, because you want the balance of propagation and speed, right, through your RF signals, right? And so TeraGo is a holder of millimeter wave spectrum only, right? So we own a massive amount of 24 gigahertz and 38, 39 gigahertz in Canada. And so the industry, unfortunately, and rightly so, I suppose, is focused on mid-band and low band. It's because they're trying to jam everything into a cell phone. So we do have to spend a lot of time educating customers on the difference between mobile 5G, fixed wireless 5G. What are the different spectrum bands? What does it mean? What can you expect? And why do you even want it, right? So we do have customers that come to us and say, I've heard 5G, I think I need it, right? I'm like,
yeah,
sure. Let's talk through why you think you need that, and maybe there's an application that I can solve your problem today with existing technology. It might not need 5G to solve your business problem, right? So there absolutely is a large amount of education that goes on with 5G.
Yeah, one thing that we find in our industry is that people have had it drilled into their heads that you have to move your data somewhere. It's so for us, it's, well, I got to move into SharePoint, or I got to move it into OpenText, or I got to go put it, shared file shares are bad, and I got to go move it onto something else before I can get their analytics or get the actual records management value associated with it. Which is, we're battling against a preconception that's just wrong. And we've proven it to be wrong at nuclear power plants and oil and gas companies and high pressure gas providers, municipalities, and others. I'm assuming you got similar challenges where people come in and they don't even ask the right question because they have this preconception of something they might have learned through the media or the way things have always been done. Is 5G one of those, and what other challenges do you have that are like that?
Well, yeah, again, it's back to what they hear in the media, right? So, I mean, from a Canadian consumer standpoint, 5G is going to only really be about the cell phone, right? That's all you're going to hear. So most customers come in thinking 5G is only cell phone related. So that's certainly hurdle number one. We need to educate them is that it's not only mobile related, right? It's certainly part of it, but not the only thing. Then the second thing is just really, what do they want it for, right? Like, getting back to I think as TeraGo has evolved as a managed service provider, we've really grown up in terms of, we grew up as a wireless player that would, we'll sell you an internet connection here. It's almost like the classic analogy of the guy with the watches. I got 10 watches. Which one do you want? Okay, you want that one. Here you go, right? We don't want to do that, right? It's what's the business problem you're trying to solve, right? And it might be a 100 megabit connection, it might be a 10 megabit connection, it might be a gig, right? Or it might be cloud, it might be you might need colo, you might need all three, right? So it's really getting back to, as a managed service provider, what is the business problem, and working through with the customer the challenge you're trying to solve. And I think that's the unique position you're in with your company, Jay, is that you're having those great dialogues about, I'll help you solve your business problem. It's not just about who cares where your data sits. What's your business problem? What's your challenge, right?
Yeah. And often people forget that by the time they get to us, they've been given half of the solution. Go ahead and research companies that can migrate into something. And And then they hit us and they ask us, can you guys migrate into such and such? And we're like, yes, we can definitely do that.
But why
Can
would
I
you?
ask, can I ask why?
Yeah,
And then,
exactly.
well, we thought that we needed to do that before we get any of this value, and now the education begins. So it seems like there's a lot of parallel there.
Yeah, and I think that's getting back to that. There's so much technology that, analysis paralysis for some of these folks that are stuck with making recommendations to their own senior management about what's right, what's right for us to do next with our technology strategy. And they don't know, right? So they do often come in with some preconceived ideas that you scratch your head and think, how did they how did they arrive at that idea? But good news is we're here to help dispel some of those myths and help you on your journey, right?
It makes me think of, there's some late adopters that we have sold to and we've made them very successful, and they took a risk, but it was something that they had to take because of like GDPR compliance, or that they had issues associated with their data that ended up costing them a lot of money. And they came in just kind of with their hands up going, please help. And then we helped them. And they were traditionally late adopters. Like if you think of that adoption
Right.
curve, they're long tails or they're late adopters that have been thrust into this innovator position. And lucky for us, we made them successful. I'm assuming you're running into that all the time too.
We see it with our cloud platform constantly, right? So getting back to the point where Canadian companies have been slow to adopt cloud, one of the early use cases was, well, I'm terrified of the cloud, but I'll experiment with backup, right? So I'll give you guys some backup, or I'll give you guys some, maybe I'll host my disaster recovery solution there, right? But otherwise I'm terrified. And then the disaster, the unthinkable happens, right? So they're forced to use what we're providing them. So they're forced to use their backup, or in the extreme case, they're forced to use the disaster recovery scenario. And now they're suddenly running their entire business on TeraGo's cloud. And then they scratch their head wondering, why didn't I do this sooner?
Yeah. But that's human nature though, I think, is that people, they really don't want to make a decision until they have to. Especially on something that may be perceived as being more insurance than it is. It's what's that? It's a,
well, and then the fascinating thing for us, and I'm sure you're seeing the same, like once they buy into it, then they grow really quickly, right? So we've got customers who dip their toe in the water, and suddenly they've just jumped right in, right? So it's fascinating watching the adoption curve, right? They're really slow to pick up, and then okay, all of a sudden, and now they're just taking off, and now they're all in on anything new, right? So it's fascinating to see that cycle.
yeah, that's cool. And it's there's something about human nature that I don't even know what the word would be. Is that once you experience a tragedy with somebody together, then all of a sudden that, like, nothing builds trust like going through something difficult with other people, and you just can't replicate that through any sales pitch or logical conversation. You just need to experience it in order to build that trust. A lot of these decision making shouldn't fall on the IT person who is tasked with securing, guarding your data, and keeping your application up and running. Having advisor associated with this that has the infrastructure and is willing to take on some of that load and make sure that they can focus on their job is really powerful. And I feel like if you just say, hey, I'm gonna, and not that Amazon or Microsoft or Google or any others, they're fantastic companies with fantastic services. We're not saying anything negative about that, but they are not there to help you make these decisions. They're not there to help optimize you running your application on the infrastructure. They're there to rent your data back to you. Maybe you could talk about the difference in the managed services model, that how they're going to help the IT staff.
Well, yeah, I think, when you think about how do you decide where to put a workload, right? I think that's fundamentally what is your business model? What does that workload need to run? And fundamentally, really, where does it need to exist, right? In some cases, the cloud is perfect, right? And we're still a huge provider of cloud products and technologies. We're a massive VMware partner, and our one of our most successful products is I'll call it private clouds dedicated to a customer, but running by TeraGo at TeraGo, and that's certainly a popular service for us. But I think it boils back to, where do you want to run something, and what's the right what's the right workload, where should it be, is that Azure, is it VMware, is it AWS, is it on-premise? And you're right, you're going to have a tougher time with some of the larger players getting advice on how to do that. So a big part of what, as a managed service provider, is we will help do that, right? We're not necessarily bent on it has to run at TeraGo. We prefer it, obviously, but we're more about helping you find what's the right what's the right destination for your workload. And I think, again, coming back to the whole 5G story for the TeraGo, the journey that we're on, is we're going to see a real hybrid approach where lots of it's going to still be on premise or out at the edge where the customers are operating. I think you're going to see a real blend of the two. And it's not going to be all at one or all at the other.
Thanks a lot. This is Duncan McGregor, Vice President of Engineering and Operations at TeraGo. Duncan, where can people go to find out more about you and your organization?
Oh, the easiest place is just www.terago.ca.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Duncan.
Thank you, Jason. That was great.